The Singapore story is an inspiring one of an accidental nation that survived and thrived against insurmountable odds. But behind the Singapore story are the personal stories of Singaporeans. People who embodied the spirit, sacrifice, and successes of the times. The story unfolds in the 1960s, the decade when determination would triumph over uncertainty. It was the 1960s, and Singapore was a city with a buzz. Flashy cars, a hip music scene, and even its own Olympic hero.
车号量的推举成绩是260磅。
It was also big on motorsports. The inaugural Singapore Grand Prix in 1961 was the first international motorsporting event to feature both car and motorbike races. But not just anyone could play.
It's Visit the Orient here, and many tourists are already arriving by sea, land, and air. By the end of this year, we expect 150,000 visitors from all over the world.
The Grand Prix was part of a regional Visit the Orient Year tourism campaign, and it attracted international speedsters from Asia and Europe eager to take the checkered flag and the fame and fortune that came with it. William Liu was then a teenager obsessed with car engines. But little did he imagine he'd one day be behind the wheel, zooming around a racetrack. In the Grand Prix's second year, the event was renamed the Malaysian Grand Prix in anticipation of Singapore's impending merger with its northern neighbor.
In the next few months, we shall settle the constitutional arrangements for merger.
But by 1965, while the merger ran into engine trouble, the interest in motorsports in Singapore had grown. The 1966 installment of this annual event was once again called the Singapore Grand Prix, and it would run under this banner until 1973. William had less money and far less experience compared to his foreign rivals. But the local boy never let all that slow him down. William, in his mighty little Mini Cooper, took on all comers, showing his countrymen where the drive of a true champion came from. William's drive defined the can-do spirit of the 60s. The inner drive wasn't just good for propelling cars round a racetrack. It was also helping to make waves in another sport. Barely months after declaring independence, Singapore's athletes were competing in the 1965 Southeast Asian Peninsular Games, Singapore's first regional sporting event as a new nation. As newly independent Singapore was finding its feet on the world stage, 11-year-old Patricia Chan was getting herself and the Republic noticed in the pool. Patricia won each of the 8 events she competed in. This began a winning streak for Patricia Chan. Victories that came because she trained long and hard, and with single-minded focus. Her eyes always on the prize. her journey into the annals of local sporting history mirrored Singapore's own arduous journey to becoming a nation. For Singapore, forging an identity and finding stability, security, and success was not going to come easy. It meant sailing through violent, stormy seas. Being thrown into the deep end presented opportunities to learn and grow. William Ho had his share of tough love too. He spent his youth working on his dad's quail and poultry farm. Today, William runs the business. William's father, Ho Seng Chun, was one of Singapore's pioneer commercial farmers. In the early 60s, farming was one of the government's top priorities. After a trip to Japan he paid for himself, William's father introduced new poultry rearing innovations. Battery cages replaced free-range plots, along with factory-style housing for egg-laying hens. Ho Sr. wasn't just enterprising, he was also big on community and giving back, a trait that William says was reflective of the times. What his father gave to Singapore's farming community was a self-published farming manual. As the whir of industry propelled the young country forward, there was another 60s sound that got Singaporeans moving. It was the sound of music. Singapore had its own version of the swinging 60s with a vibrant live music scene. The popularity of live shows meant a career in music wasn't such a far-fetched dream. But breaking into the business did take persistence and guts, as local music veteran Horace Wee found out. Musicians in the 60s didn't have swinging lifestyles. Most did it for the love of making music, and in the hope that they'd be discovered. Horace's gig with Radio Television Singapore would eventually lead him to work in the recording industry. Horace is one of the lucky ones. Most other players in the circuit had much leaner gigs. Top amongst the pop stars in 1964 was a little band from Liverpool. That same year, the Beatles and Beatlemania came to town. But amidst the frenzy for the Fab Four, a Singaporean band was about to have a David and Goliath moment. Another four boys from the Tiong Bahru neighborhood in Singapore knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot in the local charts. The band was called The Quests, and they were a bunch of untrained, self-taught teenage musicians. But as swinging as the 60s were in Singapore, it was still a conservative Asian society, and these conservatives were always watching. Gangsterism, drugs, pornography, outlandish attire. In fact, anything conservatives considered decadent were condemned. This was Singapore's anti-yellow culture movement. Mass media channels like TV were strictly monitored for any violations. For a young country set adrift in uncertainty, sports and the arts weren't pressing priorities. So those who made it against the odds, people like swimmer Patricia Chan and musician Henry Chua, became local heroes. In November 1964, one of the Quest's original compositions, Shanti, launched the band into regional stardom by knocking the Beatles off the top of the charts. For many growing up in the era, The popular anthem captured the spirit of the times, but the mood of the 60s weren't always upbeat. Like on the 10th of March, 1965, a day forever etched in Henry Chua's memory. The bombing was the result of the Indonesian government's opposition to the formation of the Malaysian Federation, of which Singapore was a part. The conflict was called Konfrontasi. It triggered a series of alarming events, threatened peace in Singapore, and heightened Singaporeans' awareness of the political precariousness surrounding them. Francis Pavri moved to Singapore with his family in the early 1950s. He grew up with Singapore in the decades that followed and braved the storms that came, both metaphorically and literally. The floods came and went, but nothing could douse the fire that fueled rapid growth. It's an often used cliché that success is a journey, not a destination. Well, for women in Singapore, in the still conservative 60s, taking that journey off the beaten path was not quite a done thing. The 60s were hip. The 60s were hippie. The 60s were also a tiny hip hooray for women in Singapore. By then, they had cast their first vote in nationwide elections, had their rights protected by law under the Women's Charter, and housework was no longer the only kind of work they were recognized for. 76-year-old Evelyn Wong is a former cop. She joined the police force in 1963 when she was only 18. At a time when it wasn't common for a woman to have a career, let alone one as a crime fighter, this was a big deal. Evelyn stuck with it for more than 30 years. One of her most memorable assignments was going undercover, gun in handbag, to protect her former high school principal who had received death threats. Scary, but for Evelyn, just another day on the job. Evelyn's life as a cop began with 9 months of intensive training at the police academy. Man or woman, you went through the same drills. But all that tough training still didn't entirely prepare you for the rough and tumble of the streets. Gangsters extorted money from businesses, including coffee shops and street hawkers, and most paid up. Tan Siak Che's father and grandfather were both street hawkers in the 60s. They sold fried kway teow and fishball noodles at the Joo Chiat Street Market. Gangsters often showed up to extort their hard-earned money, but these thugs didn't always get their way. This was the kampong spirit in action, the camaraderie of friends and strangers alike. They would come to fill their stomachs and ended up making friends. Che's father has since retired, but the bonds forged over many a bowl of noodles remain. Today, it is Che that wields the ladle at the stall, after a trial by fire under his father's stern, watchful eye. While some old ways and distant connections remain, despite the changing times, there are places of the past that needed to be sacrificed in the name of progress. Yet these are kept alive in the memories of Singaporeans, young and old. In the 1960s, Pulau Brani was home to about 500 Malays and Chinese. Islanders lived in 4 kampongs across Pulau Brani, which in Malay means Island of the Brave. Most of them served with the British military stationed at this offshore island. Madame Asia's life on Pulau Brani would come to an end in 1971, when construction of a military naval base began. The island she once called home was officially declared off-limits. The move from kampong homes set in nature to concrete flats and multi-story buildings set within the nation's sprouting public housing estates was for many a difficult transition. Over time, the conveniences that came with the move eventually helped one-time kampong dwellers settle in. But longings for the good old days still linger. One of the realities new flat dwellers had to contend with was space, or rather, the lack of it. Resettlement was more than just saying goodbye to the old. It also meant adjusting to the new. Resettlement, while difficult, brought progress. As the 60s came to an end, Singapore, just 5 years independent, was looking forward with anticipation to the next decade. A decade of getting things done and growing and finding an authentic Singapore voice. The 70s would be the decade the lion roared and the world took notice. In this tiny country, just 5 years into independence, the rhythmic whir of industry was the soundtrack for the times. A pulsating backbeat that offered the promise of a brighter future. It was a time for exciting new experiences.
Have a nice day. Have a nice day.
This was Singapore in the 70s. If the 60s in Singapore were swinging, then the 70s were cooking, because this was a decade of rapid transformation. The British troops were out, and foreign investment was in. Buildings got taller, and highways began spreading across the island like arteries. Singapore was powering up to take flight. Sure, Singaporeans worked hard, but they also began playing hard. High talent fees, a 100% increase in live entertainment tax, and an all-Central District night spots must stop operating at 1 a.m. regulation made doing business tough for nightclub owners. While they couldn't get around the 1 a.m. thing, an alternative to the hassle of hiring and managing live bands was music from vinyl. Enter the disco. Well-known Rediffusion DJ Larry Lai was about to ignite disco fever in Singapore with his mobile disco concept, dance music that could go to any party anywhere on the island. But commercial sound systems and disco lighting were hard to come by in the 70s. So Larry and his business partner Mike Ellery had to get creative. For $250, you could get down and boogie to 4 hours of disco music, complete with strobe lights, a disc jockey/MC, and 2 go-go girls to liven up the atmosphere. As it turned out, the only thing Larry was crazy with was success. As the mobile disco business started raking in the big bucks, hotels and nightclubs jumped on the disco wagon.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. They're each walking away with
popular radio or television presenters were hired as headliners at discos, and crowds poured in.
Hi, good morning. This is Brian Richmond getting you up and about and keeping you on the bright side of things on this beautiful Sunday morning. Let's get underway with the Bee Gees and their 1978 chart buster called You Should Be Dancing.
Brian Richmond was a big name in Singapore's 70s disco scene, and he's still on air today.
Good. We have also 4 solid hours.
In the 70s, the club DJ was king, and the dance floor was his domain.
We're going to get into the second hour of the vintage.
As disco fever raged in Singapore, along with the good times came trouble. Fighting and drugs invited unwanted attention from the authorities. Then, in 1973, wanting to clean up Singapore's image, they lowered the boom on discos. Licenses were revoked, and many discos shut down. Those that remained open were slapped with restrictions. Only in 1975 were some of these restrictions relaxed out of necessity. Despite this bump in the road, the disco continued to be the place to see and be seen, especially in the wake of the blockbuster movie Saturday Night Fever. Raymond Chong was only 17 when he fell in love with disco. Raymond's unique dance moves did in fact win him the title, Singapore Disco Champion 1980. And set him off to compete in London, where he put Singapore on the international disco dance map. And this fiery spirit would carry Singapore through the 70s, as the island nation prepared to open its doors to the world. If the 60s represented the birth of a nation, then the 70s was Singapore's coming of age. The decade saw many firsts as the budding nation sprinted towards its aspiration of becoming a global city. Singapore's car population was also growing in the 70s. Perhaps a little too enthusiastically, so the nation's first road pricing scheme was introduced. More highways were built, and the first of these, the Pan Island Expressway, was extended. With all these cars whizzing about, it wasn't long before the most American of entertainment concepts opened in Singapore. This was the drive-in cinema. Going to the movies was a popular pastime, offering an escape into other worlds, and the drive-in element added novelty. Run by Cathay Organization, the open-air cinema could rake in up to $12,000 a night in its heyday, especially for the more popular movies. In the 70s, kung fu movies were hugely popular all over the world, and Singapore tried to muscle in on the action. But Ring of Fury would not be screened in Singapore for nearly 30 years because it was banned.
呵，真是够种啊！找我妈的麻烦，算不得好汉。飞刀哥，快上来！
Its hero was a vigilante. And the film's themes, related to gangsterism, were sensitive issues in 1970s Singapore. But when some Hollywood film producers looked at Singapore, what they saw was alluring Asia meets modern metropolis. And the ideal setting to shoot their movies. Ironically, most of these shot in Singapore Hollywood movies weren't shown here because they were thought to portray the country in a bad light. St. Jack would only be screened in Singapore almost 30 years after its release in 1979, and it would be hailed a classic. One 70s film that tried to change the usual Asian hero narrative was a joint Singapore-Hong Kong-Philippines production. The good guy in this movie was a woman.
We have to move fast before this thing gets out of hand.
That's why I cut short my vacation in Manila. Do we have any leave?
Unfortunately, none. You have to work it out from scratch.
They Call Her Cleopatra Wong was an attempt to resuscitate a local film industry that had lost the luster of its golden years of the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, television was increasingly becoming the easy-to-access entertainment option for Singaporeans. For starters, it was right there in the living room. And then, 1974 happened. As color TV captivated Singapore audiences, the local film industry continued to fade to black. In fact, no Singapore films would be made in the next decade. A significant blank page in the documentation of local history. As asphalt replaced dirt roads and concrete replaced atop roofs, it wasn't just popular culture that would affect Singapore society. Foreign businesses setting up shop here would introduce new work cultures and open the doors to a new world of opportunities. Rolai, Isetan, McDonald's. These were just a few of the big names that arrived in Singapore in the 1970s. Barely 5 years after gaining independence, Singapore achieved a 100% employment rate. Jobs were aplenty, and many from neighboring countries came to find one. Thomas trained in Germany for 7 months, learning to build shutters for roll-eye cameras. It was an eye-opener. Back in Singapore, Thomas applied what he learned in Roll-Eye's Chai Chi factory. Hard and soft skills alike. These were marketable skills that could be used in many other manufacturing sectors, even in the worst of times. In the 70s, manufacturing helped fuel Singapore's economy. But a growing economy needed a better equipped workforce. And a better equipped workforce could only come from revving up education and knowledge acquisition. In 1970, Singapore's first community library opened in Queenstown, Singapore's first satellite town. The library wasn't just about cultivating the reading habit. It also nurtured friendships.
How are you? Great. Yeah. Shall we go to the library?
In here, but now no more table and chair here. Yeah, now that you mention it, I do remember that.
Grace, now a retired teacher, first met Lai Lin when she joined a volunteer group at the Queenstown Library in the 70s. Called Friends of the Library, the group organized events at the library, performed during festive seasons, and held book meetings. To this day, friendships formed over books remain, as does the Queenstown Library. Modern on the inside, but with its original facade intact for old time's sake. Housing estates with community facilities sprouted up across the Singapore landscape, so there'd be no reason to travel to town unless you were young or hungry or both. Fast food culture was part of growing up then, and it reflected some of the buzzwords of 70s Singapore: efficiency, speed, productivity. As for Jeffrey Tan, he went from being a McDonald's kid to becoming a McDonald's employee, and he's still on the job.
Oh, good. Great. Thanks you very much. Okay. See you later.
For 40 years, Jeffrey stuck with McDonald's, working his way up from service crew to senior director. Persistence and the determination to succeed were traits that defined many of Jeffrey's generation. As Singapore fast-forwarded through the 70s, much in the country was changing. From the skyline to the economy to lifestyles and aspirations. But that one constant was the Singaporean search for that still elusive, uniquely Singapore identity. TV personalities, movie stars, magazine models. Fashion was making itself felt almost everywhere. The demand for ready-to-wear fashion grew, and retailers were happy to oblige, especially the Japanese stores. Local department stores had to up their game to keep up. Tang's, or CK Tang as it was known then, went all out.
Please repeat after me. Have a nice day. 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 Have a nice day.
For
Meanwhile, Japanese department store Isetan set the standards for 70s fashion retail here. Professor Tay Keng Soon, one of Singapore's pioneer architects, designed People's Park Complex with this atrium in mind. He was also responsible for the iconic Golden Mile complex. And build is what the nation did. Skywards, office towers, hotels, housing. But as these new structures went up, some of the old were torn down. The 70s was prep time for Singapore. The stuff of early nation building had started to fall into place, and the machinery of growth had begun humming. Singaporeans were experimenting with notions of what their identity might be, and the stage was set for the 80s and beyond. Everyone remembers the 1980s differently. But for many Singaporeans, the decade could be summed up in one word: progress. In the 80s, Singapore reinvented itself on all fronts. Singapore was open for business, and the world was starting to take notice. From crisis to celebration, the 80s brought a new social consciousness and a clearer understanding of what it meant to be an independent nation. The 1980s were a decade of progress for Singapore. If the 70s saw Singapore working hard to woo much-needed foreign investment, then the first half of the 80s were its honeymoon years. The Lion City became an Asian tiger, one of 4 countries in the region whose economies were fiercely transformed during this period. Singapore's roar was heard overseas, and foreign money continued to roll in. In the early 80s, low unemployment and relatively high wages made Singapore the envy of the region. Singaporeans left the challenges of the past behind for a better life. Many Singaporeans went from slogging it out just to make ends meet to having more disposable income for some of life's little pleasures. Orchard Road, Singapore's main shopping street, would in the 80s undergo a serious upgrade. Flashy new malls, commercial buildings, and hotels. This street became a symbol of Singapore's growing affluence and a draw for locals and tourists alike. With the malls came a new kind of subculture. Bands of youngsters with imaginative haircuts and outfits to match. They weren't violent for the most part, but they did earn a reputation for shoplifting, underage smoking, and glue sniffing. Depending on the mall they favored, they were either the Far East kids or the Centrepoint kids. These places were where the cool kids of the 80s chill. DJ Aldrin Kwek was neither a Centrepoint nor Far East kid, but he did hang out a lot at Far East Plaza. Today, Far East Plaza is not the mall of Aldrin's youth. His favorite store is gone, but the mall still holds special significance for him. In the 1980s, breakdancing was in. And it was not long before the breakers started taking over other parts of the mall. The rise of flamboyant Singapore mallsters and hardcore breakers represented more than just 80s pop culture trends. It reflected a willingness of some Singaporeans to step out of their comfort zones and dare to be different and to take risks. One prominent risk taker in the decade was Sim Wong Hu, an engineer in an oil company. In 1981, he poured his life savings into an ambitious project. In 1986, Sim's company launched the Cubic CT, the world's first multimedia computer. But the worst thing that can happen to a computer happened to his venture. It crashed. To save his business, Sim shifted his focus to making sound cards, microchip circuits that enabled computers to play audio. In 1989, he launched Sound Blaster, promising crystal clear, high-fidelity audio, ideal for computer games. It was an instant hit when it was launched in the United States. Today, 30 years after he launched Sound Blaster, Sim's creative technology is an international household name and still a world leader in sound technology. Creative success coincided with a new industrial revolution for Singapore, when productivity became the buzzword. From producing low-cost goods like textiles, local factories of the 80s churned out computers and other electronics. By the end of that decade, the city was a hub for high-tech manufacturing. There were 650 multinational corporations and over 1,000 international financial and trading firms. But to draw in even more investors, the country's infrastructure needed an upgrade. In the 1980s, Changi Airport opened. It helped Singapore attract even more international business and further elevated the Singapore brand. But it was another mega project that really got Singaporeans talking. Despite initial opposition from transport analysts, the government went full steam ahead with its ambitious subway project. In 1987, Singapore's first mass rapid transit, or MRT line, began operations. Teacher Helen Yeoh was among those on board the maiden ride. That first ride was a historic moment for Helen. She's kept a physical reminder of how big a deal it was for her and the country. But progress, as they say, is impossible without change. As Singapore rolled out initiative after initiative, change was a near constant experience. To address the critical needs of a developing nation, some of what was had to be sacrificed. This was the cost of progress. Singapore, the modern island paradise. That's how Singapore was being sold in the 1980s to both locals and visitors. In the early part of the decade, the country was making steady progress establishing itself as a global financial center. But tourism, a key pillar of the city's economic growth, was slipping. One resident was called upon to help pull those declining numbers up. When orangutan Ameng was made poster girl for the zoo in the 1980s, she instantly became one of Singapore's most recognizable icons. And as her popularity grew, so did the number of visitors to the Republic, many of whom flocked to the island just to visit the Singapore Zoo, where she was the star attraction. Ameng died in 2008. While former director Bernard Harrison is grateful to Ameng for her contributions to both the zoo and Singapore tourism, he also remembers her as a petulant diva who relished VIP treatment. Bernard is credited with injecting new life into the zoo in the 1980s. He revamped many of the enclosures to simulate more natural animal habitats, which in turn created a more interactive experience for visitors.
On the island, can they move up to the
No, they can't.
So unless you put a bridge across.
Yes.
But he believes it was one idea in particular that helped turn the zoo around, one that is still being used today. Dining with animals wasn't the only wild idea that Singapore used to woo tourists. In the 1980s, they were also promoting trips to hell. Haw Villa had been around since the late 1930s and was already a popular Singapore family attraction. This large public park featured thousands of statues and dioramas depicting colorful scenes from Chinese mythology. Among them were very graphic exhibits depicting torturous consequences for sinners in the afterlife. But this was gruesome blood and gore with a practical purpose. Haw Villa's founders, brothers Ao Boon Haw and Ao Boon Pa, built the place to promote Chinese values. They hired Adeline's great-grandfather to maintain the park and provided his family free housing on the grounds. By the 1980s, 4 generations of her family had lived and worked in the park. She has fond childhood memories of tagging along with her father, the park's chief artisan, on his rounds. At a time when there were few places for kids her age to play, Adeline and her cousins found all the entertainment they needed right here in the park. But the fun and games came to an end in 1985. In a bid to draw more visitors to the country, the Singapore Tourism Board devised plans to turn Haw Villa into a modern theme park with thrills and spills. Once again, it was in with the new and out with Adeline's family. They were relocated to a housing estate. The new theme park, which came to be known as Haw Villa Dragon World, proved to be a commercial failure, and the attraction eventually returned to being a public park. While Adeline and her father appreciated regaining free access to their beloved Haw Villa, their relationship with their former home and playground was never the same again. This sense of loss and dislocation was also felt by others in the country. In the 80s, many of Singapore's remaining kampongs or villages were redeveloped. One of them was Kampong Santeng, which sprawled across an area the size of 180 football fields. It was home not only to 1,000 residents, but also thousands of Chinese graves, which gave the village its unique identity. Chua Ik Chuan lived in Kampong Santeng for 46 years before he and his fellow villagers were relocated in the 80s. They found new homes for themselves and their dearly departed. But Mr. Chua feels something precious was lost. Something that may never be recovered. Tradition. Today, Kampong Santeng goes by another name, Bishan New Town. This is one of Singapore's most developed estates. Today, in place of tombs, traditional tea houses, and kampong dwellings, stand community amenities. But the past is still present in Bishan. Kampong Santeng's legacy lives on in the Pek Santeng Memorial Park. The columbarium here houses the remains unearthed from the original cemetery. There is also a museum offering a glimpse into the rural lives of Kampong Santeng's residents. Some Singaporeans found the transition from village life to an urban lifestyle difficult. But many came to accept the redevelopment policies of the 80s as necessary for progress. But the decade also saw locals devising clever and creative ways to lament the loss of such cherished places and traditions through the arts. From mudflat to metropolis, that's been Singapore's journey. By the 1980s, Singapore had indeed become a modern global city. As more high-rise apartments and office buildings towered over the country, the island became increasingly unrecognizable to those who grew up in kampongs and kelongs. Many accepted this as part and parcel of development. But some found expression of this sense of disconnect through the arts. Playwright Kuo Pao Kun was one of them. He wrote the allegorical tale, The Silly Little Girl and the Funny Old Tree. The play follows a lonely schoolgirl who misses her late grandfather and the conversations they used to have in their dialect. She befriends a tree who teaches her to explore her cultural roots. Kuo cast unknown 19-year-old actress Ang Gay Pin as the silly little girl. Now an accomplished theater director, Gay Pin has revived Kuo's classic play. The first time she read the play, she was gripped by issues she had never even thought about before. In the play's poignant conclusion, the silly little girl discovers that her beloved tree has been destroyed. It leaves her lost and distraught. In this heart-wrenching scene, Kuo conveyed his message that the loss of cultural identity was the price Singapore paid for its strong focus on economic growth in the 1980s. It was a powerful theatrical moment when art reflected reality. While Kuo's plays were designed to drive discourse, other art forms celebrated life in Singapore. The Singapore of the 80s had an exploding live music scene. But there were also musicians who felt there ought to be more to the local music scene than just cover versions of popular hits. In 1982, the Sinyao movement was born, and it was all about celebrating the Singaporean identity through original Chinese music. Veteran Sinyao singer Han Ying was groomed by legendary composer Liang Wen-fuk, one of the movement's pioneers. Han Ying still performs in Sinyao reunion concerts. She feels Sinyao still has a loyal following, but nothing like it was at its peak in the 80s. As Sinyao became music to the ears of Chinese-speaking Singaporeans, things were also brewing on the small screen. To improve the quality of its Chinese TV dramas, the national broadcaster SBC hired directors, scriptwriters, and camera crew from Hong Kong. These seasoned professionals helped raise the bar in local TV production. Wang Yuqing has been acting in Singapore TV dramas for more than 3 decades, playing over 200 characters. But he'll always be remembered for that role that propelled him to stardom. In 1983, Yuqing was cast in The Flying Fish, a drama series about a young professional swimmer. The producers packaged and promoted Yuqing as an idol for the younger generation. He became a major local celebrity. 80s TV shows were also used to promote core values among Singaporeans. The showrunners sought to inspire viewers to realize their full potential. And with historic dramas such as The Awakening, which Yi Qing also starred in, they tried to evoke a sense of appreciation for the sacrifices made by the earlier generations of Singaporeans. In the 1980s, Singaporeans may not have lived through the hard times presented on screen, but they did have an awakening of their own. When a series of disasters rocked the nation. The 80s introduced many technological innovations to Singapore: the Walkman, the Game Boy, the personal computer, and the VCR. Once again, new tech changed the way they lived, worked, and played. The 80s also gave Singapore its 10 millionth cable car passenger. The cable car system linking Singapore to Sentosa Island had been around since 1974. It was a popular airborne means to get to the resort island and back. But former Air Force crewman Hua Kim Hai's experience of this attraction was anything but fun. On the evening of January 29, 1983, Kim Hai was off duty when he was called in for a mission that would change his life forever. The accident was caused by the Enuitok, a Panamanian oil rig which became entangled with the cable car's ropeway. The cable snapped and 2 cars plunged into the sea, killing 7 passengers. 4 more cars dangled precariously, nearly 100 meters above. Kim Hai was in the first of 2 helicopters that were dispatched to rescue the 13 trapped passengers. It was one of the most difficult operations of his military career. Singaporeans again stood up to be counted on in the face of the 1985 financial crisis. And again, when Hotel New World collapsed in 1986, people from all walks of life came together to help those most affected. Surviving such adversities made Singapore stronger. To celebrate this growing unity and to lift spirits, the Singapore government began commissioning national songs in 1985.
There was a time when trouble seemed too much for us to take, but we did.
One national song in particular did all that.
National Day. Count on me, Singapore. Let's show the Singapore can count on us and sing along with Clement Chow.
In the 80s, Singaporeans didn't just sing their hearts out, they also cheered their lungs out.
Lovely ball for Pinky. Pinky brought down. Is it going to be a...
This was Malaysia Cup football fever. Fandi Ahmad was, and still is, a Singapore sporting icon and a rallying figure in the local football scene. But in the early 1980s, Singapore's favorite soccer son left the country to play for FC Groningen in the Dutch League. To his surprise, many Singaporeans supported his decision to leave for Holland. They were proud that Fandi was the first Singapore player to make it to a professional foreign club. At a time before cable TV and online streaming, Singaporeans followed Fundi's overseas career with keen interest. They cheered alongside Groningen fans when Fandi made history in 1983 by becoming the first Singaporean to score in the renowned UEFA League during a match against the fabled Inter Milan.
A chance for Fandi Ahmad, yes, and he puts the beyond doubt there. Fandi Ahmad, the Singapore boy, making his European...
That, in a nutshell, is how best to describe Singapore in the 80s. It was the decade of putting one's best foot forward. From reinventing manufacturing, to to making the nation's voice heard overseas,
Number 11 says, oh.
to achieving shared goals. The 80s put Singapore in high gear, building up momentum for even more rocket-fueled progress in the decades to come. The Lion City had begun to soar. It was a decade marked by pride, progress, and optimism.
The 90s was let's get down to some business. We wanted to be world class.
A time of celebration.
Deep stuff, really deep. I'm leaving the 80s behind and I'm coming into a new glittering stage in the world.
An era when local talents stole the spotlight.
We have to create something authentic, something that belongs to us.
I think most importantly, the 90s is about where, as a nation, we grew up.
This is how Singaporeans remember Singapore in the 1990s.
I'm going to tell you a story. Sit!
In the 90s, Singapore was transforming. The gears of its economy were shifting. From manufacturing to a new economy based on knowledge. And everywhere, everything seemed exciting and new.
Hey, look, boy, I want you to see.
I'm the best in Singapore and JB and Batam.
Always looks great on stage and off.
Wow, this is fun. I enjoy dressing up. Fashion Unlimited, most stylish local personality. Wow!
The Asian man of the 90s.
Was that me?
That's what Najib Ali was once known as.
Oh my God, it's Najib Ali!
Najib Ali, a TV host, actor, and singer, was very aware of the changes Singapore was going through. Najib was at the heart of it all. Globalization was the word du jour of the 90s. A bold new era, accompanied by a new and equally bold look and outlook. Scenes of those cultural collisions happened often, especially when lifestyles and businesses were transforming. And as Singapore became more visible to the world, a 21-year-old American arrived. That's me, Mike Kasem, in my first real job.
About, you know, the Western Christian feast of All Hallows Day for me.
And being cool was very welcomed, especially among Singaporeans who've had enough of being called staid and straight-laced, or all work and little play. In the 90s, the Lion City tried loosening up. One venue was the star of the Singaporean party scene. Zouk upped the ante in the local and regional nightclub scene. For many, especially the young and young at heart, clubbing at Zouk became a rite of passage of sorts. As the live scene buzzed, entertainment on the tube played catch-up. MTV arrived late to Asia in 1991, 10 years after its debut in America. Round-the-clock music videos quickly changed how people consumed music and made unlikely celebrities of its presenters.
Welcome back to MTV Screen. We're going through the alphabet.
I was
But in the early 90s, when Singapore was a land without MTV,
nobody knows who I am.
It's hip. It's snazzy. It's MTV.
MTV embodied being hip and trendy. It became an instant hit, especially amongst Singaporean youth, who were craving to catch the latest fashion and music trends from around the world. Cable TV opened Singaporeans to influences from across the globe. It also helped push an exciting new era of growth and maturity of local television.
You must go shopping to feel better. And when you feel better, you want to shop some more, right?
In the 90s, Singapore had evolved into a bustling cosmopolis. And the styles and sensibilities of East and West seemed to be quickly merging in different forms. Cable TV was one of those forms. It was a hit.
Get this! MTV are giving stuff away. I'm the one!
But the country's sole national broadcaster didn't take the competition sitting down. They raised their game. As cable brought in the allure of foreign trends, Singapore's free-to-air producers looked inwards and thought local.
45 degrees. Wet.
Local TV would tell Singaporean stories. Ng Se-yong played a pivotal role driving the English drama unit. He struck gold with Growing Up.
You know how much is this plate? How much only? It's very cheap, what?
Set in the 60s to 80s, the weekly drama revolved around the Tay family.
I told you I don't like this brand of tea. How come you still buy?
Their daily struggles mirrored the ups and downs of many Singaporeans living through those decades.
Go and apologize. Go.
Okay. Tonight, right? I'm late already.
David.
Tonight.
Pa? Is Ma okay?
She says she's not feeling very well this morning. I told her to go and see her sensei. I don't think I can go on without you.
But things were never the same when the Tay matriarch character got killed off. Something that Singaporean audiences didn't take in too easily. Growing Up's success came from the values it portrayed on screen, either directly or indirectly, values that were intrinsically Singaporean. These journeys into the past gave Singaporeans in the 90s a clearer sense of their Singaporeanness, especially as the cultural influences of the West poured in.
It's a cat I got free. Did you see his parents?
Crush him under your foot like you would a cockroach.
1994's Masters of the Sea, helmed by veteran American soap opera executives, did not resonate well with the viewers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My father died half an hour ago.
He was my father too. If he was ill, why didn't you tell me?
There was no need.
Hey, how come I never get pretty nurses like you to look after me?
Across its hits and misses, local TV concepts reflected an era of experimentation as shows took on influences and ideas from everywhere.
Philosophical. Being sorry for yourself won't get you.
Just as experimental was the 90s art scene.
Smile in my head, I saw us.
In the 90s, with the business of economic survival, infrastructure, and national security more or less on track, the government began paying more attention to the arts.
That you're so attractive to His Majesty.
Throw away your temple keys, poor child.
As the art scene began effervescing, new spaces were needed for creative expression. This is the substation. Once literally an electric substation, it now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Alvin Wong played at the substation with upstart 90s surf punk band Force Vomit. The venue was where a new generation of local songwriters and musicians cut their teeth and exposed their brand of music to a wider audience. But the flip side to increased attention given to the arts was increased attention paid to the arts. There was freedom to create, but within the boundaries of what was deemed permissible for public consumption. OB markers indicated what was out of bounds, sort of. Many artists pushed the envelope, trying to figure out how far they could go. Until 1994, when one performance artist was deemed to have crossed the line. As artists tried to express themselves freely in physical space, and the authorities watched for infringements to OB markers, a new technological advancement of the 90s would introduce Singaporeans to a wider, more open virtual space. The internet had landed. From accidental nation to economic miracle in just 3 decades. Singapore was a picture of progress in the 90s. And the wheels of a second industrial revolution were beginning to turn. The 90s heralded the beginnings of the information age. Today, it's impossible to imagine a world without the internet. Thousands of messages are sent across the island every second in a relentless blaze of communication. But this wasn't so 30 years ago.
This is Asha speaking. Can I help you?
In the late 80s, the internet was restricted to a very small community, mainly researchers, scientists, and tertiary students. It was Tan Tin Wee who helped bring the internet to more people in Singapore. Tin Wee's work on the internet in Singapore would go on to enable the creation of many internet-connected services. Unknown to him, it would even help singles find romance. Finding love online may seem like a common thing now, but in the past, it was quite the taboo. Human connections weren't the only thing the internet afforded. Its possibilities for business and commerce tantalized savvy entrepreneurs. E-commerce pioneer TK Wong was one of them. He founded Singapore's first internet startup, Silk Route Ventures. The dot-com boom of '95 saw the first wave of tech startups. Singapore was fiddling with the idea of online delivery, the precursor for present-day food delivery apps. But the e-commerce trend was not kind to every business. Some once thriving businesses started losing out to online competition. Elim Chu's 77th Street was one such casualty. 77th Street was a fashion haven for teens in the 90s. This was the place to come to for affordable streetwear. Being a one-stop source of the latest street fashion trends was 77th Street's unique selling point. The internet's worldwide reach would change that. As the internet made its way into the lives of Singaporeans and Singapore businesses, the country was riding the crest of a big wave of economic success. Until July 1997, when that wave came crashing down. After just 3 decades of having been thrust into independence, Singapore had not only survived, it thrived. Affluence and aspirations soared. The 5 C's: cash, car, condominium, credit card, and country club membership became the focus of many upwardly mobile Singaporeans. As Singaporeans pursued the good life, the country excelled in many areas: education, arts, tourism, and sports. It was one big party until the music suddenly stopped.
The Singapore economy showed another round of none-too-good figures. November's non-oil domestic exports experienced its sharpest decline since February last year.
It was 1997, and the unsympathetic party pooper was the Asian financial crisis, the AFC. Joe Chu was a 25-year-old quality control technician and one of many who felt the effects of the AFC. Joe was retrenched, along with 28,000 other Singaporeans, the highest ever recorded since the last economic recession. A pall had been cast over Singapore's 90s party. Retraining gave Joe Chu a new career. The Asian financial crisis brought many valuable lessons for Singapore. But even as Singapore pulled itself out of the '97 financial crisis, there was another storm brewing on the horizon. An MIT programmer sounded an alert that a potential glitch on computer systems threatened to bring the whole connected infrastructure grinding to a halt. The fear was that anyone, any company, any government department that relied on computers would simply stop working at the very moment when December 31st, 1999 becomes January 1st, 2000. This was the dreaded Y2K bug. As January 1st, 2000 approached, anxiety spread.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The moment of truth arrived at the stroke of midnight on January the 1st, 2000. There's no doubt the 1990s was one big roller coaster ride for Singapore. We went through many highs, and lows, and even had our fair share of panic attacks. Nonetheless, we came out stronger, looking ever forward to what the future might hold for us all. Looking back at it, the 90s may seem like a decade that feels just like yesterday, but like ancient history all at the same time. At the dawn of a new millennium, the noughties, or 2000s, would usher in a bold new era for Singapore. One that would test the strength and resolve of Singaporeans. The year 2000. The dawn of a new decade. And a new millennium. The noughties were the decade when advances in technology went into overdrive. Singapore's industries raced ahead, with Singaporeans blazing trails into new frontiers. This was the decade when Singaporeans redefined who they were.
This is Q1.
And who they could be.
We become more concerned about the poor among us, the poor in the world, the planet that we live in.
They surpassed expectations, embraced their humanity, and chased their wildest dreams. January 1st, the year 2000. Like millions the world over, Singaporeans welcomed the new millennium with big parties. The dreaded digital doomsday, that nasty Y2K bug everyone feared, was a no-show. 1999 became 2000. And life in Singapore went on as it did before. Except for one thing: technology. Looking ahead, it was clear that for Singapore to be competitive in the 21st century, technology would be a game changer. To breed the kind of innovators needed to keep the country ahead of the curve, Singaporeans needed something to nudge them out of their comfort zones. The beginnings of that something was a nail-biting, scream-inducing leap of faith.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bungee!
Bungee jumping had been around since the mid-90s, but was considered too dangerous for Singapore.
Do that again! Whoa! How'd you go?
That changed in the 2000s, when risk-taking and pushing boundaries came to be seen as a recipe for success. In 2003, a new flipped-over version of bungee jumping hit Singapore. The G-Max, a reverse bungee ride, threatened to catapult passengers into the air to experience a whopping 5 Gs. That's a force 5 times that of gravity. But the organizers needed a test pilot to launch G-Max, someone who embodied this spirit of risk-taking. Enter celebrity MTV host Denise Keller, aka Miss Daredevil. Denise was an ideal choice to launch G-Max in Singapore. She was known for being hardcore and headstrong, someone who boldly went into areas considered off-limits. In the 2000s, Singaporeans let their hair down and pushed past their limits, even if it meant defying gravity. Tam Min Liang was also inspired to take the plunge. In 2005, he gave up a promising legal career and embraced his one true passion, gaming. Min Liang took his hobby way beyond the next level. Today, his company, Razer Inc., is a world leader in gaming hardware and software. They are also at the epicenter of a new subculture. As it turned out, the secret to Razer's success was no secret after all: creativity, innovation, and the willingness to take risks. These qualities would become the hallmarks of younger Singaporeans in the 2000s. They had a bold new spirit, and they weren't afraid to express it in brave new ways. If Singapore had a superpower, it would be the ability to shapeshift its economy. In the 2000s, it was time for another transformation. This time, it was to build a world-class knowledge-based economy.
It is the spirit of creativity, innovation, and multidisciplinary learning, and of socio-economic, intellectual, and cultural vibrancy that we want to help create. In the era of the knowledge-based economy, such qualities take on added imperative because they contribute to innovation, imagination, and the creation of new knowledge, key inputs in the future economy.
This was quite a tall order because creativity and innovation weren't exactly what the average Singaporean worker was known for. It was time for even more loosening up. Bar top dancing was then officially a no-no in Singapore. It was considered a safety hazard. But in the early 2000s, party animals were breaking rules and throwing caution to the wind. All in the name of a good time. In 2002, nightclub owner Dennis Fu found himself right smack dab in the middle of controversy. His bar had gotten into trouble for allowing two patrons to dance on its bar top. But Dennis needn't have worried, because to his surprise, quite a few Singaporeans supported him. They felt the ban on bar top dancing was putting creative expression in a cage. The ban was eventually lifted. In this spirit of opening up, the Speaker's Corner was set up for Singaporeans to express themselves publicly. And they did with oration, exhibitions, demonstrations, and performances. But there was an even more open arena, one with hardly any regulations, and it promised both a wider audience and relative anonymity. By the mid-2000s, 6 in 10 Singaporeans had access to this new platform, the internet.
I'm brave. The video is with toothbrush. I right over you. I got a flight to catch.
Lee Kin Mun is widely regarded as the blog father of Singapore. Most people know him by his professional handle, Mr. Brown. In the 2000s, his posts and podcasts attracted thousands of online followers each day. While he's often been called a political commentator, Mr. Brown sees himself as just a guy who enjoys taking the mickey out of everyday issues.
I want to move house lah. I want to live dangerously.
But for every class clown, there's a class monitor. So in an age where just about anyone could play publisher, questions were raised about how much the government should play prefect. Online blogs and forums gave Singaporeans a place to be heard on matters of the day. From the divisive decision to build integrated resorts, to hiccups in the train service. But this newfound space for virtually free communications also gave more insidious elements airtime.
The
The group had planned attacks on embassies, military establishments, and even an MRT station. It was news that shocked Singaporeans.
Jama'ah Islamiyah, or JI, were an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, the masterminds behind the September 11th attacks. In the 2000s, they killed hundreds of people in terror attacks in the region. In December 2001, their planned terror attacks in Singapore were thwarted by authorities. Had these taken place, many lives would have been lost at the hands of fellow citizens. As the digital landscape continued to evolve in the 2000s, so did the terror threat. To counter the spread of radical ideologies in Singapore, the Religious Rehabilitation Group was set up. Religious teacher and academic Muhammad Ali was roped in to help lead the battle against online radicalization. But terrorism wasn't the only deadly threat Singapore faced in the 2000s. The decade also saw the country being hit by one of the worst health crises in its history.
We are Singapore. We are Singapore.
The 2000s saw the birth of a number of Singaporean inventions that put the country on the world map for innovation, like the world's largest floating stage and pocket-sized data storage. While many innovators took years to bring their ideas to life, some had more urgent deadlines thrust upon them by necessity. In 2003, hospital engineer Goh Mia Siang was given a potentially life-saving challenge, one that had to be delivered like yesterday. That strange disease was later identified as the deadly severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS.
Deadly new virus sweeps through the city, one of the most densely populated.
By March 2003, it was spreading fast among patients, medical workers, and caregivers at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, where Mia Siang worked. He had to find a way to contain the airborne virus and stop it from spreading through the hospital-wide ventilation system. Mia Siang worked against the clock with limited available resources to convert the rooms of SARS patients into isolation wards. Mia Siang also set up a massive screening center in the hospital's car park, complete with a pharmacy, consulting rooms, x-rays, and other vital medical facilities. This allowed suspected SARS patients to be screened and treated without exposing those in the hospital to the virus. While Mia Siang and a dedicated team of doctors and nurses were combating SARS in the hospital, another task force was hunting the virus at the airport. They were trying to intercept infected passengers before they had the chance to mix with the general population. A better mousetrap was needed, and fast. In less than 36 hours, defense engineer Tan Yang Hao and his team, together with an industry partner, ST Electronics, devised a solution.
Singapore is using a walk-through heat detector to check if air travelers arriving from China and Hong Kong have fever. It's the first country in the world to use a thermal imaging system at its airport to spot travelers with SARS symptoms.
The Infrared Fever Screening System, or IFSS, used military-grade thermal imaging technology to detect fevers instantly. Within 2 weeks, the IFSS was successfully deployed across air, land, and sea immigration checkpoints in Singapore. Singapore's IFSS would end up being used by other SARS-stricken countries. It also received numerous accolades, including one from Silicon Valley's prestigious Tech Museum of Innovation. After 3 tense months, Singapore was declared SARS-free in May 2003. In the wake of the epidemic, a total of 238 Singaporeans had been infected, and 33 lost their lives. many of those who were directly involved in the fight against SARS emerged from the crisis with a renewed sense of hope for the future. The swift and innovative manner in which Singaporeans tackled the SARS crisis won critical acclaim from observers across the world. It also caught the attention of renowned scientists Sir David and Birgit Lane in the UK. In 2005, they answered the call by Singapore's Agency for Science, Technology and Research, or A*STAR, to help develop the country's first biomedical hub. Biopolis was built in 5 phases between 2001 and 2014. It was a bold billion-dollar investment in life sciences, a new frontier Singapore was trying to navigate in the 2000s. The goal was to improve the quality of healthcare through state-of-the-art R&D.
We've already got a base, we've done a lot of work, we've got scientists here, we've got a reputation, and we're beginning already to see results. And we're going to put more investment into biomedicine so that we will be able to do clinical research. In other words, take projects from the lab to the bedside in the hospital, so that we experiment to discover how we can treat patients best, which treatments work, what is the best procedure, how we can not only get the R&D results, but also improve medical services and medical care in Singapore.
If you reflect on it, to think that Singapore could just make this decision to become a real hub for biomedical research and then deliver on it to the extent it has in 15 years is a reflection of the willingness to take risks and to try new things. And I think there was a great buzz.
I think one of the biggest challenges early on was the scepticism overseas. You really had to sort of talk it up and convince people that this was something they should take seriously. Then by the time we started to manage to bring people who are quite well known in their field into Singapore, and as the community grew, people could see this was real and people were very impressed by the names that were coming into Singapore, and that really changed things, I think. We needed those people. I mean, it wasn't just for the reputation of Singapore outside, we needed those experienced people to help train the youngsters in Singapore, set examples for them and be their role models.
In a little over a decade, the Lanes, along with hundreds of fellow researchers in Singapore, helped broaden the medical industry's understanding of a number of diseases like cancer and dengue. They also contributed numerous solutions to some of the world's most pressing healthcare concerns.
Hi, how's it going? We've made tremendous progress. Singapore might be the home for a really good treatment for dengue, which would be great. I've seen some of the first people we employed, do really well and get very senior jobs, and that's very satisfying and kind of makes you feel you've laid a foundation for the future, because in the end it's the young people that we're going to make the difference.
One young scientist who did make a difference in the decade was Dr. Chia Tet Fat. In the 2000s, he conducted a radical experiment which highlighted the huge potential life sciences could have for Singapore. He produced the world's first glow-in-the-dark orchid. Dr. Chia beat researchers in the United States and Japan to achieve this result. To make Singapore's national flower glow, Dr. Chia successfully fused the orchid's genes with those of the firefly without creating any mutations. In doing so, he broke new ground in gene manipulation and cross-species genetics. On the back of such life-changing discoveries, Singapore's life sciences sector grew to become a multi-billion-dollar industry. But scientists weren't the only ones pushing boundaries in the 2000s. The decade also saw Singaporeans going to great lengths to achieve their goals and pursue their passions, even if it meant going against the tide. In the 2000s, Singapore continued to collect superlatives. The world's first fully automated underground metro, the world's best airline, and the world's #1 seaport. Within 4 decades, the country had moved from third world to first. And with this came first world tastes. In well-disciplined Singapore, of course, these were pursued in more or less the expected orderly fashion. But in the 2000s, hordes of Singaporeans queued enthusiastically for something they knew they really wanted and absolutely had to have. In the year 2000, 300,000 Singaporeans queued for 40 days and 40 nights at McDonald's outlets just to get their hands on limited edition Hello Kitty plush toys. This was the deal. For around $7 US, you'd get a Mac value meal and a plush toy. And all you had to do was line up for 3 hours. For queue-friendly Singaporeans, no problem. Except this time, things weren't always friendly, as toy collector Steve Lim found out. While Singaporeans certainly went to extreme lengths to realize first world aspirations during the 2000s, they also devoted more time and money to altruistic causes. Donations to charities went up, as did the number of Singaporeans volunteering to one cause or another. In 2001, construction company boss Jack Sim led by example. He sold off most of his assets and set up an NGO. The cause Jack chose to champion was a dirty job, but someone had to do it. Jack founded the WTO. Well, the other WTO, the World Toilet Organization.
So basically, we are going to Xi'an to build the 28 school toilets.
To date, Jack's WTO has helped build thousands of modern toilets in schools and communities in over 50 countries. His mission may not be glamorous, but it improves the quality of day-to-day living for millions of people. The health of the natural environment would also become the focus of eco-conscious Singaporeans in the 2000s.
So can you see there's a cluster of rocks? The big one is...
Siva Soti is a university lecturer and a devoted environmentalist. In 2001, he and a team of nature lovers led members of the public on up-close and personal visits to a secluded beach on the offshore island of Ubin. This was Chet Jawa, and it was hailed by the scientific community as a treasure trove of biodiversity. But this ecological haven was under threat. Chet Jawa had been slated for redevelopment. So when Siva and his team arrived, their sole purpose was to collect memories before this natural wonder was lost. Instead, they left inspired and with a new game plan to campaign for Chet Jawa's preservation. Their citizen-led campaign paid off. Chet Jawa lived to see another day. The government put their development plans on hold for a decade, a term that's since expired. While Chet Jawa's fate is still up in the air, Siva feels the success of their efforts to save it in the 2000s opened new doors for environmentalism in Singapore. Given Singapore's shaky start with independence in the mid-60s, hope has been that precious something that's kept Singaporeans going these past 5 decades. No matter how bad things got, they weathered the storms, got back up on their feet, and with determination, they kept moving forward. And along the way, They helped write the history of the city-state they call home.